Since 1785, the Times has been essential reading.
Now, it's essential listening.
Times Radio chooses conversation over confrontation.
Covers Westminster and beyond. Ask the right questions.
To keep you well informed.
We give words space and let the stories do the talking.
Listen on DAB radio, online, on your smart speaker or via our app.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Lindsay Finneran. I'm the Festival's Programme and Commissions Manager, and I'm really delighted to be welcoming you to the first day of the Times and the Sunday Times Cheltenham Literature Festival 2021. We've all had quite the 18 months, so it's a real joy to have a full room of kind and curious book lovers back with us. Yes, I think that deserves a round of applause. Thank you. So not only are we back with a full-scale festival, but we're back with an ambitious 3-year theme. And this festival is the first year of our Read the World festival focus. Coming from a time in which we've all been grounded, and with a new cycle increasingly filled with talk of borders, walls, and echo chambers, it's never been more vital to be thinking and reading broadly. And we want our festival, the first and oldest literature festival in the world, no less, to be your passport to a world of ideas. Over the coming 10 days, a wonderful journey awaits you. You can hop between continents in our filmed interview series with 5 of the greatest living world writers, see the Italian phenomenon Elena Ferrante be awarded the Sunday Times Award for Literary Excellence, visit amazing world bookshops such as Shakespeare and Company Paris, discover new writing from across the globe on our free Huddle stage, and hear from some of the world's leading authors and commentators as they dial in live to discussions and debates on our stages. But as we know, any good journey needs a good tour guide, and that's why we're delighted to be welcoming Anne Morgan to take up the unique role of Literary Explorer in Residence this year. As Anne is about to share with you, one ambitious reading quest in 2012 set her off on a lifelong literary exploration, and she's now one of our most passionate and knowledgeable advocates for world writing. And there'll be a chance to ask your questions from her at the end via our Slido platform. She's doing a whole host of things at the festival over the coming days, and I hope you'll join her for more. But for now, permit me to stretch the journey metaphor just a little further and invite you to prepare for takeoff and give a hugely warm Cheltenham welcome to Anne Morgan.
Hello everyone, it's wonderful to be here today and so exciting to be at an in-person literary event again. It's almost exactly 10 years since I made a shocking discovery. I was a literary xenophobe. The realization came about from a chance comment that made me look at my bookshelves in a new light. Instead of the wide-ranging, cosmopolitan array of books I expected to see, I found a rather narrow and disappointing array staring back at me. Pretty much everything was by British or North American authors, and there was almost nothing in translation. Now, correcting this massive cultural blind spot clearly required some drastic action. And so, with 2012 around the corner and the Olympics set to come to the UK, it seemed like the ideal time to go out and meet the world through books. And so I set myself the challenge of trying to read a book from every country in the world in 2012. Now, as soon as I identified this goal, I realized there were going to be some practical issues. I had to decide what the world was and how many countries it actually contained. In the end, I went with the UN-recognized list of 195 nations, to which I added Taiwan, which used to be UN-recognized. And actually, finally, in the end, one more nation to represent the extra territories that weren't on that list. So it was 196 books plus one. Then I had to work out how to fit all this reading into working and living. I was working 5 days a week and had something of a life around the edges. There was also the question of sourcing books in translation. I had very little idea at that time how books travelled around the world, but I had an inkling it wasn't simply going to be a case of going down to my local W.H. Smith and looking for books from every country on the shelves. And there was the question of choosing what to read. We all know that huge numbers of books are published all the time. Indeed, Stephen Hawking has described it in this way. If you stacked the new books being published each year next to each other, you would have to move at 90 miles an hour just to keep up with the end of the line. Beyond the practical issues, there were some deeper personal worries. Even if I could get books translated from every country, would I be able to read them properly? I knew enough from my attempts at writing fiction about the role of recognition and assumption in writing. Most of my most delicious reading experiences came from seeing places and experiences that I knew represented on the page. The old creative writing maxim, show, don't tell, relies on a degree of shared experience between writer and reader. The idea that the reader will be able to infer what the writer intends into certain symbols and shorthand details seeded through a story. The closer a reader is to a text, essentially, the more they'll be able to get out of it. The Clockwork Orange author Anthony Burgess summed this up quite neatly in 1973 when he told the Paris Review, "The ideal reader of my novels is a lapsed Catholic and a failed musician. Short-sighted, colourblind, auditorially biased, who has read the books that I have read. He should also be about my age." Of course, Burgess wasn't being entirely serious here, and in that interview he goes on to talk about the different layers in his writing that he hopes will reach readers of different kinds of proximity to his own experience. But there was a serious point here. What would I do if I wasn't equipped to understand books from markedly different traditions? What if the jokes went over my head? What if I didn't get the references or had to spend half the time looking things up? What if it was all a bit too much like hard work? At that time, academia was really one of the main forums for talking about reading world literature, and its suggestions on this point weren't that encouraging. In 2008, Professor David Damrosch published a book called How to Read World Literature, aimed at readers like me, keen to explore further in the literary world. And he proposed a series of what he called modes of entry for readers keen to read more widely. And these were essentially a list of guidelines hoping to show how readers who were interested to expand their literary horizons might have a rich and full reading experience. Oh, my clicker seems not to be working. There we are, thank you. So these included having critical awareness of the translator's choices and biases, reading different works with different expectations, learning enough about each new literary tradition to achieve an overall understanding of its patterns of reference and its assumptions about the world, the text, and the reader, endeavouring to engage with the work's original social, political, and biographical contexts. Oh, and having command of 2 foreign languages. And not just that, actually, but one, he said, from your region of the world and one from an entirely different region of the world, so that you have a sense of how different families of languages work. Now, I'm sure if I had the time and the money to follow all these guidelines, I would read very widely and very well. And this is, by the way, not to take away anything from the very many brilliant academics who've been helpful to me over the past 10 years and who are true experts in the regions that they study. But for me, there was a problem. I had only 1.87 days for each book that I was going to find and read and write about. So I didn't really have an option to do all this. So there I was, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what I was taking on, unsure of where to start and how to recognise what I should read, and very much afraid that I might lack the means to read the text that I did manage to find properly. It seemed to me that the only option was to take my not knowing as a starting point. I had to be open to what was out there and approach this project in the spirit of curiosity, being prepared to get things wrong. Now, this is not something that comes naturally to many people, and I would suggest it's not something that comes naturally particularly to English speakers. According to a 2016 survey by the European Commission, some 62% of working-age Brits speak only one language. And when you look around this country, it's not surprising. We're surrounded by English. We turn on the television and the radio and hear English. We conduct all our business in English. This is in marked contrast to the experience of many people in other parts of the world, where it's quite normal to have to switch between several languages in order to get things done. A few years ago, I was in Guwahati in Assam in northeast India, and I had a driver there who spoke 8 languages. Now here, he would be a phenomenon, but there it was just normal. It was entirely normal to have to use several different tongues to get through the day. And as a result, he didn't speak all those languages entirely fluently, but he spoke them well enough to achieve what he needed to. And so he was used to getting by. He was used to not understanding everything perfectly. He was used to being in situations where maybe his intentions and the intentions of the person that he was speaking to didn't entirely line up. By contrast, most of us in this country who speak only English are very unused to being in those situations. We don't have to use another language for official business, or we're not educated in another language. Even if we just learn foreign languages in the classroom, the teaching of the school is in English. And I think this feeling of being at the centre of most stories that come at us is compounded by the way literature is sometimes taught in schools. Most of us at some point in our lives will have experienced comprehension exercises where you're given a short extract of a text and asked questions about it. What does this word mean? Rewrite this sentence in other words, explain what's going on here. And I'm sure these exercises teach a huge number of useful skills, but they also carry the implication that if you can't explain everything that's going on in a text, you're failing. And that there is some sort of ideal, perfect reading that we should all be reaching towards. And this is an idea that I'm looking forward to playing with a bit with my incomprehension workshops, which I'm launching at the festival in the Huddle, and looking forward to taking adventurous readers into exploring the idea of what incomprehension might bring to our reading experience. Now, because I was starting from a place of not knowing, I realised I had to let go of any idea of creating a canon or list of best books from each of the world's sovereign nations. In this, I hoped to avoid falling into the pitfall of seeking out books that reflected my own preconceptions in a well-meaning but misguided quest for authenticity. This is something that I encounter frequently in conversations with readers who are proposing to look further in terms of what the world's stories have to offer. People often say that they want books that are set in the country in question and capture the spirit of a place, almost as if they were using books as a kind of telescope to view places that they might never visit. An understandable impulse, particularly for those of us who've lived through numerous lockdowns over the past 18 months. When you interrogate that idea for authenticity, though, it falls apart, because what feels authentic to such a reader will usually be what feels recognisable to them, built up from the stereotypes they've absorbed from the Western media and other similar outlets. And so as a result, such reading quests, rather than a voyage of discovery, can turn into the reader being trapped in a hall of mirrors, seeing their own ideas reflected back at them in slightly altered form. The publishing industry often doesn't help with this. In 2014, on the blog africasacountry.com, a reader put together a graphic showing how common the acacia tree was on the cover of novels set in or about Africa. including on Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, despite the fact that acacia trees are far from common in Nigeria. In The Dangers of a Single Book Cover, the acacia tree meme and African literature, Elliot Ross wrote that wherever you're from, whatever kind of writing you do, if you write a novel about Africa, chances are you're going to get the acacia tree treatment and the orange sky. In short, he went on, the cover of most novels about Africa seem to have been designed by someone whose principal idea of the continent comes from the Lion King. In order to try and avoid this reductive and limiting approach, I decided my project had to be about perspectives and voices rather than authenticity and setting. After all, British writers write stories that venture all over the world. Why shouldn't a novel by a Zimbabwean author set in London or Russia or outer space be every bit as fascinating and illuminating as one set in downtown Harare? My not knowing also meant that I had to be open to being guided by others. I knew pretty quickly that I was going to have to ask for help. And so, almost exactly 10 years ago, I registered the blog ayearofreadingtheworld.com, and on the 24th of October 2011, I posted this short appeal online, explaining who I was, what I was hoping to do, and inviting anyone who was interested to recommend what I might read from different parts of the planet. Now, I had no idea whether anyone would be interested, but actually the response was pretty overwhelming. Very soon, I was receiving messages from people all over the world. 4 days after I posted this appeal online, I had a message from a woman called Rafida in Kuala Lumpur offering to go to her local English language bookshop and choose my Malaysian book and post it to me. And a few weeks later, a package arrived containing not one, but 2 books, Rafida's choice for Malaysia and one that she and the bookseller at Silverfish Books in Kuala Lumpur had picked out as a possible choice for Singapore. I was amazed by the generosity of this stranger 6,000 miles away, but in fact, Rafida's kindness proved to be the pattern for that year. Time and time again, people went above and beyond to help me achieve my goal. It was just as well they did, actually, because when it came to the question of sourcing books in translation, things got much more complicated than I could have imagined at the start of the year. Roughly 11 of the UN-recognised nations on my list had no commercially available literature in English translation at the time of my quest. Now, that's significant because English is the world's most published language. It's the language of the internet, but it's also the language in which the greatest proportion of books are published. And as a result, it is really the language in which stories circulate around the planet. If you're translated into English, your chances of being translated into other languages are much greater. And so it really does have a huge impact on who is read and who is heard. And so people went to all sorts of lengths to help me. I ended up being sent unpublished manuscripts from various countries that I couldn't buy anything to read from. Things that people had commissioned in the hopes of getting a publishing deal. Things that people had translated for fun during their PhD. Perhaps the most extraordinary example of this kind of help came in association with this book. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might notice that the title, A Caso do Pastor, please forgive my accent, is not in English. In fact, none of this book is in English. It's in Portuguese, which is an official language of Sao Tome and Principe, a tiny African island nation. And when I tried to get a literature from there, I couldn't find anything. No matter who I asked, I kept drawing a blank. And I was pestering anyone and everyone, charities working in the region, students on their gap year, doctors on placement, and everyone came back saying the same thing. In the end, I put an appeal on social media, and astonishingly, within a week, I had more volunteers than I could use to help translate this collection of short stories into English by Alinda Beja, a Sao Tomean-born writer, into English. And within 6 weeks, all my volunteers stuck to their word and sent back their translations of the stories that they had taken from the collection. I had the entire book to read. Now, this kind of exploration and using people's recommendations and unpublished manuscripts meant I, in effect, was doing a sort of literary off-roading. A lot of the texts that I read hadn't been through the curation process that a lot of books that come into the UK market receive. And as a result, I was discovering all sorts of things that usually don't come onto our radar, as well as many brilliant writers that are usually overlooked in this part of the world. I was particularly delighted to hear yesterday that Abdulrazak Gurnah has been given the Nobel Prize. He was my choice for Tanzania back in 2012, and he is well worth reading. Now, in fact, that was a bit quick. Sorry, I'm going to stick there for a moment. And it wasn't just about getting books that people helped me, but also understanding them. Often when I found that something didn't make sense to me, or that I was tempted to dismiss something as bad or, flawed in some way, I came to learn through discussions with readers from elsewhere that it might often be my reading rather than the book that was limited. As blind spot after blind spot was revealed, I was frequently reminded of what polyglot and internationalist Goethe apparently told Eckermann in 1827, that being able to correct one another was the greatest use of world literature. It certainly felt that way to me. One of my biggest corrections involved redrawing my sort of mental literary map. I suppose it used to be based on this picture, which many of us will be familiar with. Indeed, I expect many of us had something similar to this on the classroom walls where we sat doing our comprehension exercises many moons ago. It's a pretty standard depiction of the world based on the Mercator projection drawn up by Gerardus Mercator nearly 500 years ago. And it's a pretty fabulous piece of work in that it does the impossible. It presents a globe on a flat piece of paper. But in order to solve this mathematical impossibility, it makes some compromises, perhaps the most significant of which is enlarging the Northern Hemisphere quite substantially. So on this version, you'll see Greenland and Africa appear to be roughly the same size, when in fact Africa is 14 times larger than Greenland. And of course, being Flemish, Mercator put Europe at the centre of the map. And I'd lived with this picture all my life, and I suppose when it came to books, I'd thought about them in a very similar way in terms of who was at the centre and which voices were relatively important and relatively big. We hear this often in discussions about literature, talking about the centre and the margins, marginalised voices. And it's easy to see how this sort of idea feeds into our thinking, even if we don't realise it. This came home to me particularly when I had a discussion with the Qatari author Abdulaziz Al Mahmoud, whose novel The Corsair was translated into English conveniently during my 2012 quest by Amira Noywera, and I was privileged to be one of the first readers of it in English. The novel is the story of the struggle to control the trade routes in the 19th century in the Persian Gulf, and it features characters from a range of nations, including Britain, because the British Navy were significantly involved in the area. And one character in particular stood out to me, called George Stadler. It's a nasty piece of work in the novel. He betrays a lot of the people he comes into contact with and really isn't someone you'd want to spend time with. And I said this to Al Mahmoud, and he laughed. He said, well, actually, the Stadler in his novel was a great deal more sympathetic than the real-life George Stadler he'd found in the history books. But this character was so dastardly and horrible that if he'd put him straight in the novel as he was, people wouldn't really have believed him. And at this I felt very ashamed, and I sort of launched into this apologetic rant about how awful the British had been. And he laughed again, shrugged me off and said, oh, well, they weren't great, but the Portuguese and the Dutch were much worse. And I realised that my instinct was to put my nation at the centre of his story. If it couldn't be the hero, it had to be the villain. It had to be one of the most important things. Whereas for him, it was just simply another player, another pawn that he could mobilise in service of his story. This conversation and a number of others like it during and since my quest prompted a key realization for me about how I could shift my reading in order to have a deeper, richer engagement with books from elsewhere. While I couldn't possibly know the context of every literary work I encountered, while I had no hope of doing all the preparation that Professor David Damrosch suggested, I could be as aware as possible of myself as a reader, and use that understanding to bear in mind the things I was likely to assume or miss. Of course, it's difficult to step outside your own head and know what you don't know, but by understanding my own tendencies and what I had been conditioned to, and what I was most likely to respond to, I could see where the pitfalls were more likely to be. And so, with apologies to Damrosch, I've drawn up my own list of recommendations for approaches we readers might take to achieve a fuller and richer reading of the world. And these involve developing critical awareness of our own choices and biases, reading works with no expectations, understanding our patterns of reference and assumptions about the world, the text, and the reader, engaging with our social, political, and biographical context, and being prepared to let go of the rules of English as we understand them and be open to seeing the language remoulded in all sorts of playful and extraordinary ways, with Spanglish and Hinglish being some of the more exciting modes of English that I've discovered in some of the books that I've read. And it means really, I suppose, interrogating knee-jerk reactions, interrogating the first response you might have when you read a book that you're aware is from a tradition that is some distance from your own. It doesn't mean switching off your critical faculty or forcing yourself to trudge through books that you're hating and are making you miserable. Although I have to confess I did stick to most of the things I decided to read during my year because there really wasn't much time to change my mind. But I think we should read to enjoy. But essentially it's about, rather than being anxious to know exactly where you are and what's going on all the time, trying to maintain a spirit of openness and curiosity. And this isn't always comfortable. It's tiring. It requires mental effort. You're continually challenged and corrected, as I was, and it's difficult to get used to reading holding questions in your head. Reading books by people with markedly different perspectives to your own will see you challenged and very probably changed. Seeing your nation depicted in a book that may not have been written with you in mind as the reader can be an uncomfortable experience, a bit like hearing yourself spoken about by someone who doesn't know you're listening. When I found myself confronted by the accusation, "You British always pride yourself on playing cricket and being fair, but deep down you're all racists to the bone," in Singaporean novelist Suchin Kristin Lim's Fistful of Colours, I was plunged into confusion and denial. Surely the character speaking couldn't be talking about me here. My reaction and the many damning depictions of British colonialism that I have since encountered in literature from elsewhere sent me on a journey of further reading and thinking that led me to reevaluate a lot of my beliefs and realise the incompleteness and partiality of many of the narratives that prevail in Britain. A partiality that British writers such as Sathnam Sanghera, Reni Ido-Lodge and David Olusoga, as well as the wonderful writer Michael Holding from Jamaica, have exposed powerfully in recent years. In addition to broadening my horizons, my reading quest remade my understanding of myself and my world. I've travelled a long way from the person I was at the start of it, and I've had to say goodbye to some comforting assumptions, but my view now is much better. Uncomfortable and inconvenient though all this can be, it is worth the effort, because time and again, as I was amazed by when I first heard from Rafida, I have seen the extraordinary power that stories have to connect us. This is something that has come home to me repeatedly over the past decade. And I've been privileged to have really moving and touching and deep discussions with readers of all kinds from all over the world, including a Mormon woman in the US bothered by reading about sex in books, a university lecturer in Burundi, an aspiring writer living in a hostel in Delhi, and an artist in Honduras. When Jens Nielsen, the partner of Aglaia Veterani, the Swiss author whose book I read during my original quest, contacted me, I was delighted to meet him, and we spent a wonderful afternoon talking about Veterani and her work and her untimely death. We had a connection that we would never have had if we hadn't both shared and loved her work. Because I think that's what's so powerful about stories. They make us all citizens of the same imaginary landscape. This was something that came home to me particularly strongly in an exchange I had a few years ago, and one that I have to confess has been on my mind a fair bit in recent months. An email arrived in my inbox from a schoolboy. He had discovered my blog and was excited about the idea of reading books from different countries. English wasn't his first language, but he spoke it well because his father had read him the Dr. Seuss books when he was young. And he was very keen to see what he could find from different countries. But there was a problem. He lived near Kabul, and there were no bookshops where he was, and Amazon didn't deliver. So how could he get books? Now, I did a bit of research and found an NGO that might be able to help, but because I liked his enthusiasm, and I have to stress I don't do this in most cases, I decided I would also send him some books. And it took a bit of doing, but after a crackly phone call with a depot in Kabul, I received an email saying that my parcel had arrived. And a few days later, another message followed. The boy had read the first book in my selection, New Amsterdam Books and Saki Books' translation of Ismail Kadere's Broken April, a story set around the blood feuds in northern Albania, one that focuses on this sort of tit-for-tat killing that often dogs generations there, where one member of a family is enjoined to avenge the death of someone else, and so on and so on. And the boy wrote that although this was literature set in another part of the world, it had seemed to him that he was reading about his own village. He recognised the menace and trauma in its pages all too well. On the face of it, our lives were entirely different. And yet, through reading that book by that wonderful author set in an entirely different part of the planet to which neither of us had ever been, we had common ground. Our minds had moved, however briefly, along the same tracks, and for the time that we inhabited the story, we had looked at the world from a similar perspective. A lot has changed in 10 years. 2 of the countries on my list have new names. We've had Brexit, Me Too, Black Lives Matter protests, COVID. In many ways, you might say this country is now a less outward-looking and optimistic place than it was. The internet has changed too. There's been fake news. Algorithms have grown increasingly sophisticated these days, reflecting our own ideas and likes back at us with uncanny accuracy. And while this no doubt saves us a lot of time when we're searching for things, as well as making certain corporations quite a bit of money, it has the effect of limiting our awareness of what else is out there. When I wrote my book, Reading the World, back in the early 2010s, I used the term stoogle to describe stumbling upon something while Googling, which time and again was quite a helpful thing in finding books from some of the harder to reach nations. I rarely stoogle on things these days. Now, we are not even conscious of what we are missing out on in many cases. So slick and seamless is the tailoring of our encounters with the virtual world to our individual likes and habits. It's as though we're trapped in a section of a bookshop featuring only volumes similar to what we've read before, with such alluring covers that we don't even notice any gaps on the shelves. I'm not sure it would be possible for an unknown individual to read the world and make connections with such a diverse range of book lovers in the way I did 10 years ago now. On the positive side, there is a growing interest in reading more widely. Translation sales are up and have been growing steadily over the last 2 decades. Book sales in general have boomed over the pandemic. And festivals like this are putting the question of reading the world at the centre of the discussion. Reading the world is no longer the preserve of academia, and the world is much larger than the European language literature that made up the bulk of world literature studies in decades past. Indeed, academia is also having much more wide-ranging conversations with brilliant projects such as SOAS's multilingual locals and significant geographies exploring new approaches to world literature. There are lots of translations, exciting new translations coming through into English, and the last 10 years has seen an explosion in the number of small presses bringing wonderful literature from often overlooked parts of the planet. I'm particularly pleased with a couple of them. In fact, it's been a delight to hear that a number of the 11 UN-recognised nations that had no commercially available literature during my quest now are at least represented on the world bookshelf. Two of these translations are particularly close to my heart because they came about because of the gaps that my project exposed. This one, The Ultimate Tragedy by Abdoulaye Sylla, was translated by Jethro Suter, the first ever full-length novel to come into English from Guinea-Bissau. And this one, Beyond the Rice Fields by Nevo, translated by Alison M. Charette, who, when she heard that Madagascar had no commercially available novels in English, went to Madagascar and spent several months there and came back to the United States with 2 suitcases of books, determined to find something to bring into English. There have been shifts in publishing that reveal a greater acceptance of difference, and the way that books are presented on the page is quite a strong tell about the sort of reader that publishers expect. There are shifts in italicisation and footnotes and other kinds of furniture that suggest a sort of opening up in terms of what sort of difference readers are prepared to deal with. And there's more work to do on this. It's also been great to see initiatives in the last 10 years springing up to highlight some of the gaps that we still need to address. Women in Translation Month, started by Maitel Radzinski back in 2014, has made August the month to read books by women and has been incredibly powerful at highlighting the real imbalance that during my quest was prevalent in what came through into English. Some 70% of books were male-authored back then, and indeed that was a bias that my quest reflected, and something that I've tried to address since. World Kidlit Month celebrated its 5th anniversary last month and has done a great deal to broaden children's bookshelves in the UK. And I'm delighted to be talking to Ruth Ahmedsai-Kemp later, one of the key driving forces behind that brilliant project. And the hashtag Name the Translator campaign has done a lot to highlight the need to pay more attention to who writes the words in the books that come through into English. Indeed, Jennifer Croft, translator of, among many others, the Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk, has said that she will no longer take on any publishing projects that do not promise to feature her name on the cover of a book. And this is important because it's not simply a question of giving credit where credit's due, although that does matter a great deal, but it's also significant that while we may not be able to be aware of all the choices and biases of translators, as Dan Roche suggested, we should at least know who brought a book through into English. As reading the world becomes more popular, some challenges remain. The authenticity trap continues to lie in wait for the unwary. We have to be careful that we are not merely reading Western publishers' constructs of what particular nations have to offer. At the start of this year, a tweet circulated. It says, "I've discovered a pattern about Japanese books in translation." I wonder if you can spot what the pattern is. And I have to say, not every single book up there is translated. John Hersey's novel is not a translation, but it is set in Japan, and the point stands. The message is clear. If you like Japanese literature, you'll like these books. And it's an understandable and familiar marketing strategy to signpost readers towards books similar to what they've enjoyed before. But of course, the idea that Japanese literature is a homogeneous type of storytelling is problematic. And if taken to extremes, approaches like this risk not only warping our perception of what different nations' literature is like, but also making it harder for brilliant books that don't conform to that style to find an English-speaking audience. Similarly, amid the many necessary discussions about broadening the range of voices published in this country that have been happening in recent years, we need to be careful that we don't inadvertently squash and limit creativity in our desire to create space for certain stories. In our efforts to increase representation, we mustn't corral writers into writing only about subject matter that feels authentic to those making the decisions, or require them to be ambassadors for their communities. We mustn't lose sight of what fiction is: a humane attempt at imagining beyond the limits of our own experience that, by letting us shake off the trappings of selfhood, allows us to draw closer to one another. Writers of all nationalities and backgrounds must be free to be curious, playful, and adventurous, to make things up and to make mistakes. We as readers can play our part in keeping the channels open for the world's stories to circulate as freely as possible. We can make a point of seeking out fresh perspectives and supporting organisations and publishers who bring innovative, groundbreaking stories into English, rather than simply repackaging tropes and themes that have sold well before. We can share books from elsewhere that we've loved with family, friends, and the online community. While continuing to cherish the familiar books we enjoy, little by little, we can shift and broaden the algorithms that trap us in very particular perspectives. And in so doing, we can nurture and draw strength from that universal love of sharing stories that so overwhelmed me when I set out to read the world. That love shows no sign of decreasing. 10 years on, I still receive regular messages from readers, writers, book groups, translators, and students all over the planet. At the start of this year, I opened my inbox to find a video message waiting for me from another schoolboy, this time in Beijing, wanting to tell me about a book that explained why tomatoes can sometimes be quite dangerous. That love and enthusiasm for sharing stories fills me with enormous hope. Despite all the challenges that we human beings face, storytelling represents an extraordinary source of commonality that can connect us across political, cultural, social, and religious divides. It's a formidable tool to bring us together in all our difference and difficulty, because it breaks down the othering and polarization that so often lead to division and hate. It's the reason why, a decade on from the start of what I thought would be a year-long project, I know I'll be reading the world for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful and the perfect start to our 10-day and 3-year literary exploration. If I can learn how to turn on an iPad, I can ask you some questions. And I should say that this code, these instructions do still work. So if you want to be entering questions at this stage, they will pop up on the iPad. So we have... Which book was your... Oh, big question. Which book was your favourite out of the 196?
Oh, that old chestnut. It's a really difficult one to answer because there were so many books that meant special things to me for all kinds of reasons, because of what people did to get them to me, because of the significance of the story, of the struggle that it had had to come through into English. And just some really wonderful reads, and it's impossible to pick one out as an absolute best or anything like that, but one that is close to my heart, and I think because it shares something of the spirit of my quest, I often mention it, is a book called An African in Greenland by Tete Michel Pomasi, who's a Togolese writer, and it was translated by James Kirkup. And it tells the story of Pomasi, who grew up in a village in Togo, one of 24 children. And he had a fit when he fell out of a tree and was scared by a python, and was taken to the python cult priestess to be cured. And in payment, they said that he would have to go and spend 7 years living in the jungle with the python cult, which he didn't fancy because he was scared of snakes, quite understandably. But he came across a book about Greenland in his local evangelical bookshop. What it was doing there, who knows? He decided that he was going to run away and go to Greenland. Not only did this wonderful country have no snakes, it had no trees in which they might hide, he wrote. And this is true, he did this. He went up through Africa and up through Europe and to Greenland and lived with the Inuit for 2 years, and the book is his memoir. And it's so curious and joyful and about connection and about exploring the world. And it's just an extraordinary man, so I loved that book. Yeah.
Thank you. Which book most challenged you, or perhaps challenged you to the greatest amount, your perceptions? Let me start the question again. Which book most challenged your perceptions and assumptions about a country?
About our country?
About one of the countries you read about, of the 190.
Gosh, that is a challenging one. It's very hard to... I suppose perhaps one that sticks out in my mind is the book I read as my choice for Saudi Arabia, which was recommended to me as the Saudi Arabian Sex and the City. It was a book called Girls of Riyadh, and the name of the writer and translator, I'm ashamed to say, escaped my memory at the moment. But it was about the lives of a number of women living in Riyadh who conducted these quite sort of full and covert lives under the surface of this quite repressive regime, and certainly did challenge the prevailing stories that many of us hear about that country.
There's a question here that says, what have you been reading since finishing your challenge? But I think perhaps the challenge hasn't finished for you. It's a lifelong thing.
Yeah, it's funny. For a year and a half after the project, I was quite exhausted when it finished, and I thought that was going to be it. I thought I'd finished my year of reading the world and I would disappear off into the night. But people kept contacting me, and I continued. I felt I needed to continue. But what tipped the balance, I'm actually talking to her, I think, in the next couple of days, is a woman called Daniela Petraccio, who is the director of the UK branch of Europa Books, wrote to me and said, I'd like to send you a book by a writer I think you'd like. And I said, well, I'm not doing any more on the blog now. And she said, I still want to send it. It's a book called My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferranti. Now, this was before Ferranti was well known in this country. And she sent it, and I was blown away by it, and I thought, I've got to tell people about this. So I then, off the back of that, I started doing a Book of the Month slot on the blog. And every month, from all these messages I continue to get, and from my own reading, I select one book and write about it on the blog. So that will continue as long as I have eyes to read and fingers to type.
And just a quick sort of practical follow-up question to that. I mean, how many books do you get sent a month? How many books do you try and read a month? Tell us a little bit about sort of how do you organise your reading?
Well, it's tricky because I'm a fiction writer, and there are lots of books that I need to read for research, and I need to stay abreast of what's going on in this country as well. And people do try and send me lots of books, and I usually say no, because if I'm going to read a book, I prefer to buy it and support the industry. And I've been lucky with my project and my books being published, and so I feel... And also because my house would just be full of books, so we wouldn't be able to live. So I tend to be quite selective, and in terms of number of books, I mean, it can be 20 books a month, it could be 10 books a month. It depends really on what else is going on. But I suppose it's a mixture of instinct and curiosity. And I think part of why the project resonated with a lot of people is because it is a personal quest. So it's not scientific, it's not adhering rigidly to particular guidelines. It's driven by my own curiosity, my own interest. And so someone will send me a message about something and it will just catch my interest, and I'll think, yes, I'll read that, I'll go and buy a copy. And I think that is important as readers. We need to listen to our own taste. There's no fun in being told you have to read something, really, is there? It's a bit punishing. So,
it is indeed. And staying on that personal question, talk to us a little bit about the sort of the personal connections you've made through the project. You've been emailing with people all over the world, and some of those have become friends, haven't they?
Yeah.
Even if you haven't met in person.
Yeah.
Any standouts?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of the authors who were, most of the authors who I read during the quest are still living, with one or two exceptions, because most of the books were roughly contemporary, a few exceptions to that. And yeah, I mean, the woman whose book I read from Burundi, called Marie-Thérèse Toyi, whose book, she couriered it to me from Nigeria. DHL excelled itself. It only took 2 days to arrive. Quite extraordinary. And she and I have been in contact. She now is a lecturer in Burundi, and we exchange emails several times a year, and she continues to write. And that's very touching. I hope one day to be able to meet her. In fact, we were supposed to be meeting at a literary festival in India, but COVID had other plans. So, yeah, but there have been a number of exchanges like that, but also relatives of people whose books have been in the project who have got in touch to say how much it means to see that literature represented. And it's just a real joy, actually, to see how proud people are to see their work. I mean, you know, who am I? And yet someone's so delighted to find that book on the blog. Yeah,
that's wonderful. Somebody's asked, did you find ebooks and self-publishing helped improve access to global voices that might otherwise be curtailed by publishers' commercial needs?
Yeah, I think that's true. There were several books I read that were self-published, one from Mauritania. Mauritania does now have some literature in English translation that you can buy, but at the time it just had this self-published novel by a Mauritanian who had gone to study in the US and had written in English and self-published this novel. And it was essentially a manuscript and quite rough, but it had a spirit that I don't think you'd see in a lot of mainstream Anglophone publishing. And yes, I think that's certainly true. Self-publishing has democratized a lot, while it has its own problems.
Thank you. Somebody's asked, many authors such as Dumas and Verne that we don't think of as being read in translation, should we read them again through the lens of a translated text?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that could be, it is worth remembering. I think that translation always has at least 2 layers, sometimes more. There are these things called relay translations, where a book comes through several languages. And in fact, later today I'm talking to the Icelandic author Ragnar Jónasson, whose novel Winterkill is a relay translation. It was translated by David Warrener from the French version into English, which is unusual these days, particularly for sort of big mainstream books. Normally you'd see, coming into English, they'd be translated directly. But that relay translation idea is, at every stage you get an extra mind that the story is being filtered through. And I think that is a fascinating thing to bear in mind, that not knowing, that sense of, I'm not quite sure how to take this, acquires an extra dimension when it's a translated text.
Thank you. What is the main fictional genre that runs through your choices? Peter has asked.
Oh, it's hard to say, because genre, as we understand it, doesn't necessarily work in the same way in many parts of the world. Indeed, fact and fiction don't necessarily have the same boundary lines in some traditions. And so, I mean, I suppose you'd broadly say that I mostly read literary fiction, but it has been interesting to read different kinds of genre, to see, for example, how crime novels have quite different incarnations in different parts of the world, and often that's to do with a different understanding of what a story is being told for. We might read a crime novel to find out what's happening next, for the suspense, the page turning. In other parts of the world, that's not necessarily the case. In China, for example, you might read a crime novel to learn about detection techniques. Didacticism is a big part of why crime novels are published there. So understanding that, genres don't necessarily have quite the same meaning.
And just a small question to round off here. Has the way you read and interpret meaning changed as a result of your project? If so, in what way?
Yes, absolutely. I think I tend to be much slower to make snap judgments. That doesn't make sense. But slower to make judgments about things, and to appreciate that there are usually much more complexity to things. There's much more complexity to questions than may meet the eye. So yes, much more nuanced, rich richer, more complicated, sometimes more tiring, but ultimately more rewarding.
Thank you. And you mentioned there the crime panel you've got this afternoon. I wonder if you could just round off by telling the audience what else you're doing over the 5 days with us.
Yeah, very exciting. I mean, there's so many things that I'm sure I'll forget something. I'm talking to Ruth in an hour or so, as I mentioned, Ruth Ahmedzai-Kemp, about where books took me, and children's, with a particular focus, I think, on children's books, although Ruth translates from 3 languages and has done a huge range of things. I am particularly excited about launching my incomprehension workshop, which I'm going to do on Sunday and Monday, and I am looking forward to a bit of literary off-roading with whoever will join me in the huddle, and thinking about what do we mean when we read the world on Tuesday, and talking to several really interesting writers, including Nick Bradley, who wrote The Cat in the City, set in Tokyo, and Graham Armstrong, who wrote a novel drawing on his experience as a gang member in North Lanarkshire. So there's going to be lots of fascinating things. I'm really excited and so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's wonderful to have you. Anne is going to be heading over to the Waterstones book tent just over the hall to sign copies of Reading the World. It's quite a short signing because she's got a quick turnaround to her next event, but as she's mentioned, she's with us for 5 days. There'll be time to chat to her in more depth after other events. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in giving a huge thank you to Anne.
Like flowers cultivate in cracks in the concrete, culture grows in the spaces between the everyday. It's there in darkened rooms when the stage lights come on. It's in a park full of people belting out the same song. It happens in classrooms, having a go, hands-on. It's found in small circles, exchanging stories. It's under a tent, making brand new discoveries. It's in those shared experiences that help build communities. It inspires change, provides opportunities. It brings joy, sparks curiosity. It provokes feelings recognisable to everyone, making our hearts race and giving us goosebumps. It's for those who don't think they can have it. It's for those who know that they need it. It fosters connection and understanding. It is ours for the taking, as well as the sharing. Culture is what makes us human. It makes our world better. Culture is our culture. Let's explore it together.
That being a writer was something that I could be, because, I'll let you into a secret, my handwriting was terrible.
I really wanted to meet her. When I heard about it, I just couldn't believe it. It encouraged me to write more and follow my dreams.
To have this here, we've been reading a class text for the last 5 weeks. They are engrossed in it, and to be able to meet the author is just, they're starstruck. It's amazing.
I think it's so important. It's such a nice environment for them to actually enjoy reading and to encourage their imagination.
So when we tell a story, we keep it alive. When you say it's all right with you, you're happy. I'm so lucky. I'm so unlucky.
The winner of the 2021 Clipper is the absolutely brilliant On the Move by Michael Rosen, illustrated by Quentin Black.
Don't fetch, don't hook, don't grips, don't fots. Take the bagels out of your socks. These letters on here, CLPE, the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education. Remember it, really everybody remember it. They have done more than anything. Keep poetry alive.
I'm very excited, truly humbled to be here at the Cheltenham Literature Festival. It's actually a dream come true for me, so very excited. The secret to life for sure is a little wiggle and a little cha-cha-cha and a little paso doble or even a samba around the kitchen. I would like to think that Strictly will last forever and ever and ever. It's exciting, it's full of fun, and every year something different happens. It's nice to meet you.
You don't often, as an academic researcher, get to have the real-world consequences of the work that you do with your colleagues in your arm, but both Sarah and I have AstraZeneca in our arms.
I was confident we would have a vaccine. The question was, how effective would it be?
Thank you very much.
This is for us a short-lived thing. We have a story to tell, and then we will get back to the lab and carry on making vaccines against all the other things out there that you want to be
this
protected
is all part
against.
of making science more accessible to people, which is something that we think we need to do more of.
The essence of the book is now we have to change the perception of the average black person, the average woman, the average gay person. And then, not to say that after that's done, that they still won't be exploited or discriminated against, but they won't be exploited or discriminated against because they're black, because they're women, because they're gay.
Hello to Cheltenham Festival. I'm so sorry that I couldn't be there with you guys, but you know what? I'm coming to you from the wall, 7th highest mountain, Dalagri. And I think as a mountaineer, there's no better way to present myself from this beautiful place.